Look at contradiction on table in Brussels right now. Europe says it wants to keep frozen Russian state money as leverage and punishment for war. But also it wants to turn that frozen pile into usable cash to keep Ukraine running through 2026 and 2027. This not a technical finance story. It is power politics with a spreadsheet. Inside the European Union, there are roughly 210 billion euros of Russian central bank assets immobilized under sanctions after the 2022 invasion, and the bulk sits into one choke point institution, the Brussels-based securities depository Euroclear. Euroclear is not a retail bank. It is plumbing of capital markets, a place where government bonds and cash settle for other banks and central banks. When Russian sovereign bonds matured, the proceeds turned into cash on Euroclear's books. Because sanctions block any transaction that would return that cash to the Central Bank of Russia, the cash accumulates and gets invested very conservatively, often via central bank channels, which creates significant interest income. For almost 3 years, the political compromise was, do not touch the principal, just take the windfall profits and interest income and send that stream to Ukraine. Europe could say with some legal comfort, we are not confiscating reserves, we are redirecting gains created while reserves frozen. Even that already made many finance ministries nervous, because reserve assets supposed to be safest property in world, and sovereign immunity is a cornerstone of how states trust each other enough to hold each other's paper. Then, in early December 2025, EU governments agreed to keep the Russian sovereign assets frozen indefinitely, removing the recurring 6-month renewal vote that always created a window for one government to block extension. That indefinite freeze was already a signal. This will not be quick bargaining chip. But now the money problem for Kiev moved forward. Ammunition, salaries for soldiers, repairs to the power grid, basic social payments, all of it becomes very ugly next year if big partners hesitate. And with Washington more transactional under President Trump, Europeans forced to stare at their own balance sheet and admit that regular budget support and weapons deliveries have limits. So leaders started hunting for bigger lever that does not require new taxes, new debt, or another painful political fight inside 27 parliaments. Alternatives like using the EU budget as collateral run into veto politics and domestic resistance, and the more time passes, the more Ukraine's planners cannot order weapons or plan public spending. So the new idea is a workaround designed to look like accounting, not like expropriation. Instead of Euroclear investing the immobilized Russian cash the usual way, the proposal is to redirect that cash into special zero-coupon bonds issued by the European Commission. Zero coupon means bond pays no interest, because the interest that would normally accrue becomes the financing tool. In plain language, Europe tries to pull tomorrow's income into today's lump sum, and then use that lump sum to finance a very large loan for Ukraine, discussed publicly as about 90 billion euros to cover a big share of Ukraine's needs in 2026 and 2027. Some call it a reparations loan because the political story is Ukraine should not be forced to repay out of its own destroyed economy. Repayment should come only if Russia later pays reparations in a settlement. Politicians repeat the magic words, Russia stays legal owner of capital, and therefore this is not confiscation. Belgium hears something else. If this goes wrong, the lawsuits and retaliation land on us first, because Euroclear and the assets concentrated here. And the deeper issue is not Belgium, it is the Eurozone's reputation. Reserve systems run on trust, not on morality speeches. If major reserve holders conclude that political crisis can transform frozen into spent, They start thinking about diversifying away long before the next crisis arrives, and that is a strategic cost Europe cannot easily price. What matters here is that once you move from interest to principal engineering, you are no longer in the comfortable zone of sanctions. You are in the zone of precedent. Today it is Russia, a state that invaded a neighbor. Tomorrow some other state will ask, if politics turns, will our reserves be next? And this is exactly the kind of question that makes central banks quietly rebalance portfolios over years, because they do not wait for crisis to test the rules. Europe can still decide that the strategic benefit worth it, but it should understand it is spending not only Russia's money, it is spending a piece of its own credibility. Moscow understands this is a legitimacy battle, so it is striking back in the way a weaker financial actor strikes back against a stronger one, through lawfare, intimidation, and asymmetric retaliation. In mid-December, the Russian Central Bank filed a gigantic damages claim against Euroclear in a Moscow court, roughly $230 billion, and the court has already set a preliminary hearing for the 16th of January 2026. Do not imagine this is a normal commercial lawsuit. It is a political weapon wrapped in legal language. The goal is to create fear and uncertainty around the choke point, to raise the cost for Belgium and for any EU leader tempted to push the scheme forward. Even if Euroclear has little or no seizable property inside Russia itself, Russia can still try to enforce judgments in friendly jurisdictions, or simply use the court decision as justification for retaliation against Western property under Russian control. And this is where the pressure becomes real, because there are still Western companies, shareholders, real estate interests, and financial claims that touch Russian territory, and Moscow has been building counter-sanctions machinery for years. Russia already issued decrees that create a special procedure to compensate the Russian state and its central bank for what it calls hostile seizures, and draft legislation discussed in Moscow would broaden the ability to confiscate or take control of assets belonging to people and companies from so-called unfriendly states. In practice, this means, if Europe plays with Russian reserves, Russia will look for Western money it can grab, freeze, or force into state hands. The Kremlin also plays on another vector that is harder to measure but very effective in democracies: intimidation and hybrid pressure. European reporting in mid-December described warnings and targeting of Belgian political figures and senior finance executives connected to the frozen assets debate. You do not need a tank on border to make a small country nervous. You just need to make key decision makers feel personally exposed and make institutions feel legally vulnerable. Notice how markets react when politics touches plumbing. Fitch has put Euroclear on a negative watch because of the legal and liquidity risks around this EU plan. Again, this is not about Euroclear suddenly becoming badly run. It is about a balance sheet mismatch that could be created if the legal situation changes while obligations remain, and about uncertainty over who absorbs losses if Russia wins cases or if sanctions regime shifts. In other words, even the ratings agencies are saying, we see a political risk that can turn into financial risk. And that is why the EU debate becomes so tense, because if you are Brussels, you want unity and speed, but if you are Belgium, you want guarantees that the bloc will share the downside, not leave one member state holding the grenade. Here is a simple analogy. Think of a big apartment building where everyone keeps valuables in the same basement safe deposit room. One neighbor attacks another neighbor, so the building committee locks the attacker's box. That is freezing. Now the committee decides to take the interest earned on the attacker's cash inside the box and use it to fix the victim's apartment. That already makes some residents uncomfortable, but it is still reversible. The moment the committee starts rearranging what is inside the box to fund a big renovation loan, even if it promises it will put everything back later, every resident asks, if politics turns, will my box be next? This is why Russia's counterattack not only about winning money, it is about infecting the whole building with doubt. And Moscow will not stop at paperwork. The Kremlin can amplify this by threatening to seize or auction Western-owned assets that are already stuck in Russia under counter-sanctions, by expanding its list of so-called temporary administrations, by dragging foreign investors through Russian courts, and by using selective enforcement to make examples. It can also use the information domain, accuse Europe of theft, present itself as victim of illegal expropriation, and then tell the rest of the world, if you keep reserves in euros, you are one political crisis away from losing control. None of this requires Russia to win in The Hague or in a neutral court. It just needs to raise uncertainty enough that EU leaders hesitate and bankers lobby for delay. That is why you see a strange triangle forming. Brussels wants a new financial weapon, Belgium wants legal indemnity, and Euroclear wants to avoid becoming the sacrificial lamb. Russia's strategy is to widen the cracks inside that triangle and make the cost of unity feel personal and immediate. So, where does this leave us? Facts are clear. Europe needs a predictable funding channel for Ukraine next year, and the biggest pot of money sitting in front of it is Russian sovereign reserves locked inside its jurisdiction. Inference is also clear. Russia will respond to any step that looks like monetizing the principle with a package of lawsuits, counter-sanctions, and hybrid pressure aimed at the weakest political links, especially Belgium and the financial institutions in the chain. My judgment is this: Europe can do it, but only if it stops pretending this is painless. If the EU wants to use immobilized reserves as engine for a large loan, it must mutualize the risk the same way it mutualizes other strategic costs. That means explicit guarantees that Euroclear and Belgium not left alone if courts rule against them or if balance sheet gaps appear. It means legal clarity about who absorbs losses if sanctions ever lifted in future settlement. And it means preparing for retaliation, including faster exit plans for remaining Western corporate exposures inside Russia and stronger cyber defense for financial plumbing. Without that preparation, the plan becomes a gamble, and gamblers eventually lose. At the same time, doing nothing has a cost too. If Europe hesitates and Kiev faces a funding hole in early 2026, you do not just get fewer artillery shells. You get budget chaos, you get pressure for bad peace on bad terms, and you get credibility collapse. And credibility is also currency. If EU leaders talk for 3 years about making Russia pay, then blink at the moment of decision, Moscow learns a lesson. Time is on our side. Western coalitions argue themselves to death. This is why the timing around the European Council meeting in mid-December matters, because it is a test of whether Europe can take a high-risk financial step together or whether one or two capitals can paralyze action. The tougher question, the one many politicians try to avoid, is not whether Russia deserves to lose money. The question is who pays first. If Europe does not use the Russian assets, Europeans pay through higher taxes, higher debt, or reduce domestic spending to keep Ukraine afloat. If Europe does use the assets, Europeans may still pay, just differently, through legal fights, through market reputation, through retaliation against Western property in Russia, and through longer-term pressure on the euro's role in global reserves. There is no option that is free. There's only option that distributes pain in different ways. Watch one indicator in coming weeks. Does the EU produce a structure that makes Belgium and Euroclear feel protected by collective guarantees, or does it keep pushing moral argument while leaving the operational risk local? If guarantees appear and the plan moves forward, Russia will escalate its economic war, but Europe will have shown it can weaponize its financial system without fracturing. If guarantees do not appear and the plan stalls, expect Russia to interpret that as confirmation that the EU's strongest weapons still limited by internal fear. In this confrontation, the frozen assets are not just money. They are a referendum on Europe's willingness to treat economic statecraft as real warfare with real costs, not as a press release.